year is 1926. On the south side of Chicago, specifically in the Bronzeville neighborhood, there were 5 young black men from Wendell Phillips High School who desired to form a basketball team. Now, they formed this basketball team in order to participate in exhibitions at the Savoy Ballroom, a popular hangout spot that was experiencing a bit of financial trouble. Nicknamed the Savoy Five, they were taken under the arm of Abe Saperstein. Abe was from the north side of Chicago and saw some potential in the boys. Since professional basketball was segregated at this time, the team had to travel and play wherever they could, and they took on opponents wherever they could find them. This, combined with the fact that Abe was really fond of New York City and the Harlem neighborhood and wanted to capitalize on its fame and mystique, he decided to rename the team the Harlem Globetrotters. The earliest iterations of the team were straightforward basketball teams. They routinely participated in the World Professional Basketball Tournament, winning the title in 1940, and in 1948 they even beat the Minneapolis Lakers in a groundbreaking game. Chuck Cooper and Nat Sweetwater Clifton even broke barriers in the NBA, with Cooper being the first black player to be drafted by the Boston Celtics, and Sweetwater becoming the first black player to sign an NBA contract with the New York Knicks. And I'm sure everyone who's even tangentially familiar with basketball knows Wilt Chamberlain. As the team's fame grew and grew, they were invited to play games in Russia, where they were paid the equivalent of $44,000 in U.S. funds, but it could only be spent in Moscow. These games were used as evidence that the U.S. and Russian relations were improving, and even got the Russians to back off of a propaganda campaign that would have called America out on its racial relations and violence. But we don't know the Globetrotters as a straightforward basketball squad. Sometime around the 1940s, they began to incorporate more comedic and skill routines into their acts, balancing balls on fingertips, handling multiple basketballs, juggling between players. This is how most of us remember the Globetrotters, those comedically bright red, white, and blue uniforms with caricatures who routinely beat the brakes off the Washington Generals. Or, if you're like me, you probably learned about them through Scooby-Doo. We've already covered on this channel how heavy Cartoon Network was in my rotation as a kid, and there were a ton of single-season cartoons that ran on the channel in its pre-cartoon cartoon era that fooled me into thinking they were long-running classics. Now, Scooby-Doo is indeed a classic for sure, but one popular iteration of the series, the new Scooby-Doo movies, is where I first learned of the Harlem Globetrotters. I long assumed it's because I never was really into hoops as a kid, and I'm still not so much now, but I did love watching Jordan play, and my brother and I used to wear the hell out of Charles Barkley's Shut Up and Jam on the Sega Genesis. Now, the gimmick of the new Scooby-Doo movies was that the gang would be joined by a celebrity of some kind in every episode. This included actual people like Sonny and Cher, Dick Van Dyke, Tim Conway, Cass Elliot, and Sandy Duncan, who also appeared in a sequel episode on the spiritual successor of this show, Scooby-Doo and Guess Who, almost like 30, 40 years later. But sometimes the gang would be joined by fictional characters, such as the Josie and the Pussycats crossover, that made me realize that voice actors were an actual thing. Like, Alex and Shaggy are both voiced by Casey Kasem, and I don't know why, but as a kid, this is like the moment in time where I realized that this is a career, like people do this. There was also the Addams Family, Batman and Robin, and of course, the Harlem Globetrotters, who showed up on 3 different occasions. Now, at the time, I did not know that the iteration of the Globetrotters that were on the Scooby-Doo movies were not voiced by their real-life counterparts. I know as an adult it makes total sense, but as a kid, I'd assumed they were just the actual guys doing the actual voices. This left me even more confused because the only other Globetrotter media that I knew was the Super Globetrotters. And that is initially what this video was going to be about. Until when searching for episodes of this show to watch for research purposes, I ended up stumbling across its predecessor.
Hey! What? Globetrotters, oh yeah. Globetrotters, come on. We're going around the world and coming home again. Playing around the world, coming on my friend. Globetrotters, oh yeah.
So it turns out the Harlem Globetrotters had their own historic Saturday morning Hanna-Barbera co-production with CBS that premiered on the morning of September 12, 1970. The show aired 22 episodes over the course of 2 seasons and was the first Saturday morning cartoon to feature a predominantly black cast. The show featured a mix of historical Globetrotters, but they were made into more of the typical Hanna-Barbera caricatures. The legendary Scatman Crothers voiced Meadowlark Lemon, who served as the group's leader. By his side were Freddie Curly Neal, Hubert Geese Osby, J.C. Gibson, Bobby Joe Mason, and Pablo Robertson. They were also accompanied by their dog mascot, Dribbles, who wore 4 pairs of basketball sneakers, and Granny, who drove the team bus. Now, we don't know whose Granny this is. This is just a random old white woman that's with them, but we're not going to question it because she's a sweetheart. Now, being able to look at this retroactively, Granny's obviously a stand-in for Abe Saperstein, but it works here because she is more of like a cartoonish variety old lady. Now, like many of the Hanna-Barbera cartoons that we're eventually going to cover, the show was pretty formulaic, which isn't necessarily a bad thing given the era that it aired in. Saturday morning cartoons were never really episodic, and they were designed to keep kids entertained above all. If you had a winning formula, you simply stick with it. No overarching plot, no super mystery like we're kind of used to nowadays. It was just a plain and simple, straightforward slice of life cartoon. For the Globetrotters, this meant that episodes typically opened with the team in the midst of traveling, usually in their signature bus. The team was headed to either greet a friend or be part of a charity event of some sort, and they're then introduced to the episode's conflict. Being the caring guys that they are, they always choose to lend a hand, and somehow a game of basketball always breaks out and becomes a solution to the problem itself. During the game, the opposing antagonist group will have some kind of gimmicky advantage. They're playing on ice against guys in ice skates, they're robots, or they're kangaroos, or they're facing women, resulting in the Globetrotters being down at the half. In some of the episodes, the formula does change a little bit, and the mystery itself or the antagonistic group, their actions reach their climax at halftime, with some of the players having to stop both the villain and come back to win the game. Cut, rinse, repeat. Now, like I said, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is 1972 after all, and the show does a pretty good job of switching up little pieces of the formula here and there. There's an episode where Bobby Joe loses the money he was going to use to buy Granny a gift for her birthday. So they enter Curly into a wrestling match and Meadowlark has to help him win. But whoops, the thieves steal the prize money and Dribbles. The Globetrotters get the money back, but the thieves have a woman on their side who convinces the heroes to wager the prize on a charity game. They're scared to score against the women because they're too polite. And I'm being serious with all this. They didn't want to score on the women. But Granny convinces them to cut it out, and they eventually come back to win the game in the second half. Gone to the Dogs is an episode that features a parody of Little Richard, who asks the team to dog sit his dog. This causes Dribbles to get jealous, which results in them taking him to a dog psychiatrist. The psychiatrist gives them a record to play at night, saying that it'll convince Dribbles to learn how to become a real dog. So they take it to Little Richard's recording studio, but wouldn't you know it, he hears the record, and instead it hypnotizes him into thinking that he's a dog. The Little Richard knockoff jumps off the truck. He gets arrested by police. They have to go to court to prove he's not actually a dog and that he's just insane and hypnotized. More shenanigans ensue, and Little Richard ends up participating in the game somehow in his full dog act. Basically, his interruptions have them down at the half before they're finally able to snap him back into reality because the psychiatrist happens to show up. Richard performs the episode's song, and the Globetrotters make the comeback. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the show had its own soundtrack. It was produced by Jeff Barry and released by Kirshner Records and featured the likes of Rudy Clark and J.R. Bailey, and even featured Meadowlark Lemon on some background vocals. The first season pulled a 38 rating share of the audience, which is really remarkable for a series that starred a majority black cast back in 1972. Even though the show only lasted for 22 episodes, it remained on Saturday morning schedules across CBS and NBC until September of 1980. But the animated journey of the Globetrotters wasn't done, for there was a more fantastical show waiting in the works. Enter the Super Globetrotters. Premiering on NBC on September 22nd, 1979, and lasting just 13 episodes until December of that same year, the Super Globetrotters built upon an earlier Hanna-Barbera series called The Impossibles, a 60s styles band that fought crime as superheroes. The adaptation becomes incredibly obvious once you see the Super Globetrotters in action. The cast of the Globetrotters was a bit different this time around. Gone are Meadowlark, Bobby Joe, JC, and Pablo, and in are James Twiggy Sanders, Louis Sweet Lou Dunbar, and new leader Nate Branch. Scatman Crothers and Stu Gilliam also return as voice actors, with Gilliam returning as Curly and Crothers voicing the leader Nate Branch. Joining the voice cast are Buster Jones, who plays Twiggy. He played Black Vulcan in Super Friends, Doc in G.I. Joe, and replaced Arsenio Hall as Winston Zedmore in The Real Ghostbusters. Adam Wade, who plays Sweet Lou, was a 60s singer who had also had some minor television and film roles on black movies and sitcoms throughout the 70s and 80s. Hey everybody, it's our first official Frank Welker appearance, who I know we will see a ton in this series. This time around, he's voicing the Crime Globe, a basketball-shaped satellite who keeps the team abreast on the latest villainy. Every time he chimed in, he stated, "Ooga, ooga, now dig this," before letting the team know what was happening. The Globetrotters would go investigate, and eventually they would be challenged to a basketball game against whatever cacophony of henchmen the villain of the week was using. The first half, they would play as their non-powered selves, usually getting spanked, and then change into their superhero forms at halftime. I mentioned that most of their powers copied the Impossibles, and I really meant it. Nate Branch becomes Liquid Man, who transforms himself into living liquid, just like Fluid Man from the Impossibles. Twiggy would basically turn into a big-ass pile of spaghetti and was known as Spaghetti Man, using his body as a ladder and rope. He was based off of Coil Man. Geese became Multi-Man, and he is quite literally just Multi-Man from the Impossibles. He's basically able to clone himself and basically just use Double Team if you're a Pokemon fan. Two characters had original power sets though. Curly became Super Sphere, his head became a basketball, probably because he's bald, and he could pull his limbs into his giant head and bounce himself around, smash into things or grow to gigantic sizes. Sweet Lou was always my favorite. He had an afro with an endless supply of gadgets. Think of like Forge from X-Men, who could build anything even if he didn't know how it worked. Sweet Lou can just find whatever the gang needs in his hair. That's kind of OP if you ask me. Anyway, I personally still see Super Globetrotters as my favorite of the two iterations. The original cartoon is fine. There's nothing too crazy about it. It is wild to think about a time where the most famous basketball team around the nation was indeed the Harlem Globetrotters. The NBA would go on to grow and take off in the coming decades, which rendered the Globetrotters to be more of a sideshow act. They once applied for NBA expansion in 2021, but that went nowhere as far as I saw. There's not really another team in any other sport that exists in the modern era that fills the role the Globetrotters did. Yeah, gimmicky teams like the Savannah Bananas do exist, but do we really want to see the guy who lost Big Brother because he failed to play a veto that he definitely had to solve crimes or transform into a superhero baseball player?
By a vote of 8-2, Zach, you are evicted from the Big Brother house. Can you lean forward just a little bit?
Yeah. Is something?
What? Why didn't you use it?
No thanks. Also, I doubt she'll ever see this, but shout out to my homie Megan Wiggins. She's an old classmate from middle school who's a banana ball player. I believe she's the first woman to ever do so keep breaking barriers and whatnot, homie.